Welcome to the third evening of the Introducing Buddhism course. So just to recap what we've covered so far, we've talked about what is Buddhism and how it became a world religion from the teachings of a man born in India, actually born in the border of India and Nepal 2,500 years ago. Talked about his life story and how he set out looking for a way to deal with the suffering that he had encountered, suffering of old age, sickness, and death. And then last week we talked about some core Buddhist principles, and I'm going to just do a little bit of a recap on those as we get started on the talk. And there will actually be a little bit of repetition of some of those elements in tonight's talk as well. But I'd like to begin with the homework that I set you all last week. I asked you if you would decide to go to bed at a specific time and stick to that time. So I don't mind whether it was 8 o'clock in the evening or 2 o'clock in the morning. It was a time of your choosing, and I wanted you to practice sitting at that, going to bed at that time every night for a week. Now, I'm not going to invite people to comment on their experiences, but what I am going to suggest is that a number of possible things, you may have experienced a number of possible things. The first thing is that some of you will have said, that's a ridiculous exercise, I can't see the point of it, and you won't have tried to do it at all, and that's fine. And some of you will have had a go. And what I'm anticipating is that many of you will have experienced a phenomenon, which is that as you get started doing this, it's actually quite novel and quite new and quite interesting. So you give it a go. But as the week goes on and you get a little bit more settled into it and nothing particularly exciting seems to be happening, you will have found it more and more difficult to keep going with this. You will have found, in fact, that you probably didn't really want to do it at all, and that it turns out that your chosen bedtime of 10 o'clock doesn't suit, and you would rather it was 10:30 or 11:15, whatever. And indeed, if you try to keep going, I suspect some of you may have found an active resistance bubbling up inside. And that's a very interesting observation to make, because no matter how much we want to do something, and this could be true of, let's say, going on a diet, starting an exercise regimen, trying to learn a language, trying to do anything, acquiring a new habit is actually incredibly difficult, and we sabotage ourselves because we resist the discipline that is being imposed on us, even though it's being imposed by ourselves. And this really begs the question, who is in charge here? We talked last week about the concept of no self or no I, and yet we do have this very strong feeling that up here is a CEO who is directing things, and therefore, if I am in charge, then surely I can just choose to do this and it will happen. And if that was so, if I could just by sheer force of will make something happen, then why would we struggle to lose weight? Why would we go to the gym one time in January and then never again? Why would we struggle to stop smoking? All of these things we know we struggle with, and that's because there is no CEO in charge. There's just a fluctuating bundle of likes and dislikes, wants, feelings, thoughts. So you may have started the week saying, yes, 10 o'clock, that's my bedtime, I will stick to it. Almost certainly, many of you by the end of the week will have been varying on from that, or perhaps even said, I'm giving this up altogether, can't see the point. So it's a little exercise that demonstrates that there isn't actually a controller sitting up here who's directing things, that actually once you start to say, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, or I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, a little tussle starts to arise as you start to, a little bit of resistance comes up, and it's very, very difficult to keep going by sheer force of will alone. And I think that does undermine to a considerable degree the notion that there is an I who's in charge, who's overseeing all these things, because clearly I cannot do this through force of will. Okay, so a little bit of a recap on some of the things we talked about last week. So we talked about the 3 signs of being, the 3 marks of everything that's in existence, really. And that the first one of these is impermanence or change, the idea that everything is in a state of constant change, constant flux. My body is changing all the time. My cells are breaking down and replicating, and I'm constantly turning over my cells. Everything in my body is changing. The building that I'm in, over time, it starts to decay. Things start to fall off it. I need to put repair works in. Everything changes. My hair will go grey. My skin will become wrinkly. My joints will start to hurt. There's no such thing as a fixed, essential me, and there's no permanence in anything around us. Everything you see is subject to change. Now, in some times, this is a useful thing, because if there's something unpleasant, we know that it's eventually going to go away. But the most of the time, people find this a very difficult thing to accept, because we rather like things as they are, and we don't like the fact that we're going to lose some of the attractive, beautiful things in our lives. Because we can't accept that sign of being, the impermanence of all things, then we live in a world which is inherently unsatisfactory. In other words, there is suffering. The word is dukkha, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this evening, meaning suffering or unsatisfactoriness, dis-ease, discomfort. We feel ill at ease in this world of change because it doesn't suit us, that we can't hang on to the things that we like and push away the things that we don't like. That doesn't suit us. We'd rather it was a different way. And then finally, no self, no I. We have explored that, hopefully, in our exercise of trying to set ourselves a specific bedtime. But there's a very strong sense that there is somebody inhabiting this body. There is someone who is thinking my thoughts. There is someone who is choosing to do the things that I'm choosing. If there is an action, there is a doer. If there is a thought, there is a thinker. But actually, this is in itself an illusion. And in particular, the idea that I am impermanent. I am permanent in this world of impermanence. Everything else around me is changing, but I remain unchanged. That is really the biggest delusion of all. And that, again, leads to a great deal of suffering when we see that it's not so, that I too am changing. And we talked about the 3 fires, or the 3 passions, or the 3 poisons. And these are represented here by these symbolic figures, the cockerel, the snake, and the boar. And we're going to meet these figures again in a future talk. But these represent the 3 fires, the first one being attachment, or wanting, or clinging, desire. The second fire is hatred, aversion, disliking, so the opposite of attachment and desire. And the final one is delusion or ignorance, that way of not seeing things as they really are, seeing things as perhaps I think they should be, but not seeing life as it really is. So these are the 3 fires, and these fires drive us through the cycles of life, and we will come to that when we talk about the wheel of life in a future talk. So let's get on to the meat of tonight's talk, which is the Four Noble Truths. And I'm going to begin with a concept which is a very traditional Buddhist teaching, that the Buddha is seen as a physician and his teachings, the Dharma, is seen as medicine. So how does that work? So a good doctor, and I am a doctor, and hopefully I'm a good doctor. So when you go to see a doctor, what you expect from the doctor is that they will first of all diagnose what your problem is, that they will make a diagnosis. The second thing you're hoping is that the doctor will give you a clear explanation of the cause of your illness. And the third thing is we would like the doctor to tell us, what is the prognosis? Can this illness be treated? Am I going to get better? And finally, of course, prescribe that treatment. So that is what we would expect a good doctor to do. And the Buddha is described as being a physician because this is what he set out to do with these Four Noble Truths. So the first thing he did was, the first noble truth was the noble truth of suffering. That is, he said, there is suffering, dukkha exists, suffering I teach. In other words, that is the diagnosis for why we are struggling with life, why we find everything so difficult, so unsatisfactory. He said, well, this is dukkha, this is the nature of how things are. And why are we suffering? Well, he gave us the noble truth of the origin of suffering, which is that we want things, we crave things. We'll come on to that in a moment. But like any good doctor, he didn't say, well, there it is, there's your illness. Behind me is my dog who's going through his, would you stop that, please? Going through his witching hour. So if you see somebody moving behind and hear somebody howling, it's my dog who's having his little moment of zoomies. So the noble truth of the extinction of suffering. In other words, the Buddha didn't just say, well, you're ill and there it is. He actually said there's a way out of this. Suffering can be alleviated. There is a way to get past suffering, to get to the extinction of suffering. In other words, that place which we've described in an earlier talk as nirvana. And then he gave us the cure, he gave us the treatment, which is the noble truth of the path that leads to the extension of suffering. And that is the noble eightfold path, which we're going to cover in next week's talk. So let's go through these truths one by one. And some of these concepts we've already dealt with in earlier talks. So the noble truth of dukkha, suffering, disease, discomfort. Now I want to just tell you where that word dukkha comes from. It comes from, it's a Sanskrit word, and the derivation of the word is bad space. Bad space. As in, I want you to imagine a wheel on a cart wheel on an axle. If the space between the wheel and the axle isn't right, if it's a bad space, then the wheel will not turn easily on the axle. It will turn with a great deal of resistance. There will be a great deal of friction and heat will be generated. There will be squealing as you push the cart forward. And that really gets to the heart of what dukkha is about, really, that difficulty we have of fitting in with how things really are. Therefore, we have to push and fight and struggle with resistance, generating heat, those passions, those fires, making a lot of squealing noise, a lot of resistance. That is the bad space which dukkha is referring to, the fact that we are in friction with the world around us because of our inability to see things as they really are and accept the three signs of being. So dukkha, a big term which covers a lot of things, from even the slightest irritation or sense of discomfort right through to real genuine suffering, pain and grief. That's all encompassed within dukkha. And one of the reasons why we live in this world of suffering and dukkha is because of impermanence, because everything around us is subject to change. And by and large, I don't like change. I rather like things to stay as they are. I don't like the fact that every time I do the weeding in the garden, and then the next time I go out into the garden, the weeds are coming back again. I'd rather like those weeds to go away and stay away when I've pulled them out. Similarly, if I buy a nice bunch of flowers and put them in a vase, eventually they will wilt. I don't like that either. When I look in the mirror and see yet another wrinkle or another grey hair, I don't like that. Anything around me that is subject to change really causes me discomfort and distress. And that is really, impermanence is a key element of dukkha, because we don't want things to be impermanent. We want things that we like to stay with us exactly as they are forever. And the fact that that doesn't happen makes us very, very unhappy, and we resist that. Then another element really of dukkha is this concept of no I, the fact that I would like to think that in this changing world, I myself am the one constant thing. Everything around me is changing. I can be accepting that the weather changes. It's sunny today, it'll be raining tomorrow, whatever it might be. I can accept the fact that I've got to keep going with the garden, and the housework needs doing again and again and again. But I'd like to think that I myself, in the middle of all of this, am the one constant thing that exists in the universe, and everything else is moving and changing around me. But I myself am constant and unchanging. And I am separate from everything else around me. I am separate from you. And not only am I separate from you, but everything that I have belongs to me. It's mine, and you can't have it. And that intrinsic need to defend me against everything that is not me, that necessary feeling that I need to protect this self from everything that is other and that might hurt me and impinge upon my space, my possessions, that causes a great deal of suffering as well. So no I, no non-self, and my inability to accept and recognize that is another very important part of dukkha, of suffering. So we are the architects of our own unhappiness, because we will not see things the way they are. We cannot see things the way they are. We see things through our deluded, I-biased perception of the world, and we won't accept the way the situation really is. But when we talked about self and no I, we had to say, well, what do Buddhists say is a human being? What is the human experience? And if you remember, we talked about the 5 aggregates or skandhas, and we talked about form. This is my body, my sense organs, my eyes, my nose, my ears, etc. We talked about my sensations, good, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Perception, we talked about my ability to see and recognize things, or hear and recognize things, that moment of recognition. That's a car, that's a tree, that's a table. We talked about consciousness, the big stage on which all of these things come into awareness. And we talked about the thought processes, my thoughts that flow from that encounter with the outside world through my sense organs. And of course, this structure, these aggregates, almost makes it almost irresistible to think that in the middle of all of this, there is an I. There's an I in the middle of these bundles, these aggregates, these heaps. We can't resist thinking that there is still something separate from all of these 5 skandhas, which is me. And it's the essence of me. And of course, that is the problem, is because when you start really looking for that one, really looking, you can't find that person. You can't find any sense of I at all. And when you get settled into your meditation practice and you start looking carefully to see, where am I? Who am I? It becomes very clear that this is actually a mirage. It's not actually a real thing at all. And just finishing with the Buddha's description of dukkha, I mentioned this last week as well. Everything is suffering, but birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unbeloved is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates, those skandhas, are dukkha. So everything intrinsically is unsatisfactory and causes suffering. So that's the disease, if you like, that the Buddha diagnosed for us. But why do we suffer? What's the origin of dukkha? And the second noble truth is the cause of suffering is that we want things. Craving, desire, thirst. The actual word is tanha, which means thirst. So we want things in that very strong way. We have a thirst for material things, wealth and fame and power. We have a craving for other desirable things, world peace. We want the sun to shine tomorrow so that we can have a picnic. There are all sorts of things that we are wanting. And because we don't get those things, then we suffer. Sometimes we want things to go away. We don't want things and they happen to us anyway. And then again, we suffer. So some of the things we want might be very obvious things like wealth, power, a good relationship, a family, an academic career, things of that sort. And some of those things are obvious. Those are things that are obviously things that someone might want. But there are other things we think about as being rather more, if you like, subtle, more skillful things. We may want to be smarter. We may want peace. We may want justice and wisdom. Not all of these things are bad things by any means. It's not the thing itself which is the problem. It's the wanting, the fact that I want to have that thing. And if I can't have it, then I'm going to suffer. Or if I don't want that thing that is encroaching on me and it won't go away, then again, I'm going to suffer. And in Buddhist terms, there are 3 types of craving. So the traditional Buddhist teachings are that there are 3 types of craving. We crave for those obvious things I showed you in the earlier slide. So sensual pleasures, wealth and power, those are the obvious things that many people would associate with wanting, desire and craving. But also we cling to things that we think are ours. We cling to our notions and opinions, ideas and beliefs. If I have a strong view of life and you disagree with it, I'm going to get angry and it's going to make me suffer because I don't want you disagreeing with my opinions, and nor am I going to agree with yours if yours are different from mine. So clinging to my ideas, my beliefs, my theory of life is also part of this craving, this tanha, the fact that my view of life is superior to yours and yours is wrong and you must give way to me. That's part of the origin of suffering. What else do we cling to or crave? Well, we crave to this sense of self, this ego, this identity. It's very important to us, this picture of ourselves that we have that we have spent so many years cultivating and building. I'm going to give you an example of this, which is fairly topical. So I was 59 this year, and next year I will be 60, and I would like to retire, or at least partially retire. And on the day I retire, I will no longer be a doctor. And I've been a doctor since 1988, and I'm getting this real kind of jitters about the idea of that in a year's time I will not be a doctor anymore, and that sense of myself as a doctor, that identity will go, and that's making me feel slightly uneasy because I realize I have been clinging to that or cherishing in that over many, many years, and the idea that I'm going to have to give it up is going to be a bit of a struggle. So we cling to that sense of self, my identity as, in my case, as a doctor, but it could be your identity as a lawyer, a mother, a wife, whatever it might be. Your identity, once your identity changes because something is taken from you, that is a cause of suffering. We cling to the idea that we ourselves are permanent, we're not going to change. We don't like the fact that things are changing within us, subtly or not subtly. That really is, that's uncomfortable for us. And we cling to our current situation. And that might mean we go in for Botox to stop the wrinkles coming, or have things injected into our faces. You've all seen people who do these things. But we don't want to lose the things that we cherish, which is youth, identity, good luck. So we want to hang on to those things. And then the third type of craving in Buddhist terms is craving for non-existence. This can encompass simply avoidance of unpleasant things. So if you have a difficult neighbor, I have a very difficult neighbor, and when she's out and about outside her house, then I stay firmly inside my house because I don't particularly want to have a difficult encounter with her. We avoid getting ourselves into situations that may be unpleasant. We avoid meeting people who may be unpleasant to us. And that can even come to the point of driving us towards self-harm if you are so much wanting non-existence, you're wanting to get rid of the situation where you find yourself in. It does drive people to self-harm, to depression, to even to suicide. So craving for non-existence, or for getting rid of the thing that we are forced to live with, which is so uncomfortable to us, is one of the three types of craving. So these are, of course, craving is one of the three fires that we met earlier and met last week. Greed, as shown here by the cockerel, which is going around in the dust pecking. It's one of the three fires. But clearly the other side of wanting, of greed, of desire is aversion, hatred, dislike. And that's the snake coming around in this chasing, being chased by the cockerel, and in turn chasing the boar, which represents ignorance, delusion, the fact that we will not see things the way they are. And these three animals go round and round and round, chasing each other. And it's the energy of these three fires which drives us through the suffering realms that we're going to talk about when we cover the Wheel of Life in a later talk. So we've covered the diagnosis, which is the dukkha, the suffering of the world, the suffering of our intrinsic situation is that things are unsatisfactory to us. And we've covered the fact that there is a cause for that, and it's a very simple cause, which is that we want things, or we don't want things, but it's that wanting, that liking and disliking, which makes us suffer. And the Buddha, here he is represented as the physician. He said, well, there's the illness, and this is the cause of the illness, but there is a cure for this. There's a cure, and you can escape from the suffering realm that you're in. You don't have to just keep going round and round and round with this. And the cure is actually the extinction of dukkha, the cessation of those fires, the noble truth of the extinction of dukkha. And we saw this in an earlier talk, also described as nirvana. Nirvana is not a place like a Buddhist heaven. It's a state of mind. We can all be in nirvana right now at this very moment if our state of mind was more guided by wisdom and compassion and not driven by these I bias delusions. So nirvana is not a place, it's not a place we go to. It's certainly not a Buddhist heaven where you go after you die. It's a state of existence where we're not subject to the wants and liking and disliking, and those fires, where those fires are finally gentled and extinguished, and we can finally live in peace and harmony with the way life is. And that is something that is possible for any of us to achieve, for all of us to achieve, but we have to work at it. So the Buddha himself showed how to get to nirvana, to achieve cessation of suffering. And he found this when he had his great awakening. So you remember the story that he had been as a young man, he'd left home age 29 and had traveled in India for 6 years, studying with all the various teachers, trying to find the end of suffering, and then eventually sat down under the Bodhi tree, which is a fig tree, and sat down in meditation and said, I will stay here until I find the truth. I found the cessation of suffering. And it's said that he sat there and then finally came out of meditation, saw the morning star, and awoke as a fully enlightened and awakened Buddha. That's what the word Buddha means, is one who is awake, and said, how wonderful, how marvelous. All beings, but all beings, are fully endowed with the wisdom and power of the Tathagata, Buddha. But sadly, humans, by virtue of their sticky attachments, are not aware of it. Now, what this statement is saying is we can all be Buddhas. We can all be awakened. We can all achieve nirvana if we only allow ourselves to drop the craving, the wanting, the attachments. If we only allow ourselves to let those things go. And in fact, traditionally, the idea is that we are already Buddha, we are already awakened, we are already enlightened. We're just not aware of it. So your job, if you are going to follow a Buddhist path, is to acquire the wisdom and the understanding and work on those attachments so that you, little by little, get towards the place where there is an end of suffering. And the way we work on this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is the subject of next week's talk, is the Noble Eightfold Path, which is divided into 8 elements. If you remember, in the second week, we talked about the wheel of the Dharma, which had 8 spokes. And the 8 spokes represent the 8 elements of the Noble Eightfold Path. We'll cover them in detail next week, but it's essentially right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, right meditation. And when I say right, I don't mean right as in the opposite of wrong. I mean right as in skillful, the way that will lead you towards this wisdom, this way of clear seeing. And when you see this written down as a list of 8 elements and it's called a path, it's almost irresistible to imagine that you take the first step, which is right view, and once you've mastered that, you move on to right intention, etc. That's not it at all. All of these 8 elements are to be practiced and perfected concurrently. And if you like, you can think of this as the spokes of that wheel. So I don't know if any of you ride bicycles. If the bicycle's one of your spokes is loose, the wheel rim is wonky and it bumps. Similarly, when you go to get your car, when you have a new tire fitted on your car, the tire fitters will balance the wheel. They put these little weights around, because the wheel that's not balanced doesn't spin correctly. And in the same way, you have to work on each of these 8 elements of the Noble Eightfold Path concurrently, because if you're out of balance, then things will not go smoothly and the wheel will not spin correctly. So these are not steps in a long path and at the end, right meditation, and there we are, nirvana. No, you work on each of these elements concurrently, keeping everything working towards the goal, but without concentrating in particular on one at the expense of the others. You've got to really work on all of these together. So it's a path, but think of it really more as spokes of a wheel, and we're working on all of these things concurrently, not one and then the next, and so it goes on. And I'll just give you a little overview of next week's talk. And this is how things are fitting together. And so we've had a little bit of repetition already, and you can see that certain elements, that you can see how the Buddhist teaching all starts to fit together if we look at this screen. So the 4 noble truths we're talking about tonight. So the truth of suffering, the cause, origin of suffering, which is craving, the cessation of suffering, so leading to nirvana, and the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Noble Eightfold Path has these 8 elements, but the 8 elements are divided really into 3 key pillars. The first one of these is wisdom, so the ability to see things as they really are, seeing things clearly. So the 2 elements of wisdom are right understanding or right view, and the second element is right thought, right intention, and we'll cover these next week. So I'll tell you what we mean by these things. The second element is ethical conduct. I said to you at the very beginning of the course that there's no 10 commandments or anything like that in Buddhism, but Buddhists do have an ethical code of conduct. So there are ways which are regarded as being skillful ways to live and things that are less skillful. So the 3 elements of the ethical path, the ethical pillar of the Noble Eightfold Path, is right speech, right livelihood, and right action. And then finally, the mental discipline that's needed. And that breaks down into right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness or right awareness. So we'll talk about these things in much more detail next week. Okay, so those are the 4 noble truths: noble truth of suffering, the noble truth of the origin of suffering, the noble truth of the extinction of suffering, the noble truth of the path that leads to the extinction of suffering. Now, as I said to you at the very beginning of the course, Buddhism is not just something to be believed, accepted. So, right, those are the 4 noble truths. Got it, got it, got it. This is actually things you're supposed to act on. This is, if you like, a call to action. And I'm borrowing from Stephen Batchelor here when he says the 4 noble truths are things that you need to act on, not just accept and believe. So we are required to understand that there is suffering and what is the nature of suffering. We are asked to understand the origin of suffering, which is craving, and let that go. And that will enable us to realize, I think, in terms of realizing an asset, to actually bring into reality the extinction of suffering, that nirvana, that ability for us to achieve enlightenment and a harmonious existence. And finally, cultivating the path that leads to the extinction of suffering. So in other words, we're just not going to sit here and read about Buddhism as an academic exercise. There are things for us to do here. The 4 noble truths are actually telling us there's actually something that you should be doing or could be doing if you want to escape from the suffering realm that you're in now and reach that further shore, that safe shore where there is an end of suffering. So the last bit of the talk here I want to cover is the middle way, which is an important, very important part of what the Buddha taught. So along with the 4 noble truths, the middle way was one of his very first teachings that he gave to those 5 ascetics in the deer park in Benares. when he was first enlightened and set out on his teaching journey. And the concept of the middle way is really described in this parable, the parable of the lute. And this refers to a monk called Sonar, who was living and meditating out in the forest, and he was not really achieving much and starting to get very frustrated. So he came to see the Buddha and said, I'm struggling. How can you help me? And the Buddha said, Sonar, previously, before you became a monk, you were a musician, weren't you? And Sonar said, yes, Lord, I was a musician. And the Buddha said, and what instrument did you play? And Sonar said, I played the lute. And the Buddha said, okay, so think about playing the lute. If I was to play the lute and I had the strings very, very tight, would the lute sound good? Would it sound correct? And Sonar said, no, if the strings were too tight, it wouldn't sound right. It wouldn't sound good. And the Buddha said, well, if I was to loosen those strings and make them really floppy and loose, would the lute make good music then? And Sonar said, no, the music wouldn't be good if the strings were not tensioned correctly. You have to have the right tension to get the right note from the string, and then you can make the music. And the Buddha said, well, it's the same with practice. If everything is too tight, too extreme, too severe, too harsh, it doesn't go smoothly. If things are soft, if there's really little tension, if everything is really too floppy, too relaxed, things don't go smoothly. So you have to get the balance correct between too much tension and too much relaxation, in the same way that you tune your lute string exactly to the right tension. It's the same with practice. You have to get it to the right tension, and that's avoiding the extremes of extreme austerity and avoiding the extremes of extreme relaxation and luxury. There is a middle way, keeping away from those two ends of the spectrum. And of course, the Buddha himself had realized this through his own experience. Let us not forget that he had been brought up in the palace as a princeling who was going to inherit his father's wealth. And his father had got wind of the fact that his son might become a religious teacher and had decided to avoid letting him experience any harsh elements of life. So in order to do that, the young Siddhartha Gautama was cushioned from anything harsh in his existence as a young man. He was brought up in extreme luxury, and he wasn't allowed to see anything that might cause him any sense of discomfort, because that might drive him down the religious route that his father was trying to avoid. So Siddhartha Gautama, before he became the Buddha, had known every luxury that the life could offer, and yet he still didn't feel that he still saw that there was suffering in the world. He hadn't achieved anything like an end to suffering, even though he was in this blissful existence. So he went to the other extreme. He practiced, as many people of his day practiced, extreme austerities. He ate almost nothing, 1 grain of rice a day. He drank almost nothing. He barely slept. He was, as you can see here, gaunt, skeletal, on the point of death. And even then he knew he would die not having achieved his aim, which was to find the route to the cessation of suffering. So the Buddha himself knew that the extremely luxurious life didn't have the answer, and the extremely harsh life of great austerity didn't have the answer. He had to find a middle way, which is why he left his 5 ascetic friends and took some rice porridge and bathed in the river and went off to find a different way to resolve the issue. And this is interesting for us all, because I think when we start a religious practice, many of us think that the more strict and harsh we can be, the more effective our religious practice will be. So as soon as we get into a Buddhist practice, we say, right, that's it. I'm going to be a vegetarian now, or even a vegan. No more chocolate biscuits. I'm going to get up at 5 o'clock every morning and I'm going to meditate for an hour and a half, whatever it might be. We are so hard on ourselves. And as you have seen with your own exercise this week with the bedtimes, you can't maintain that. You fail. And then, of course, we get even more angry with ourselves and self-critical. So harsh austerity in a Buddhist practice is not the way. We want something that's a middle way. At the same time, completely flopping about on the couch, watching box sets and never doing anything at all towards your religious practice is the opposite way. That won't help you either. So we need to find the middle way, which is between the extremes of living a life of great, relaxation and enjoyment, and living a life of incredible severity and harshness. There's a middle way. So if you find yourself going off and saying, that's it, I'm going to wear these particular color clothes, I'm going to eat this particular food, and I'm going to live this particular life, just be careful. Don't go down the route of great austerity because it won't help. At the same time, if you've said, I'm a Buddhist now, but I never actually do anything at all about it, I can't be bothered, I can't even remember what the Eightfold Path is, then you've gone too far the other way. So the middle way is what we're aiming to achieve between these two extremes. So the Buddha said, monks, these two extremes ought not be practiced by one who has gone forth from the household life. In other words, someone who has become a monastic. What are the two? There is addiction to indulgence of sense pleasures, which is low, coarse, the way of ordinary people, unworthy and unprofitable. And there is addiction to self-mortification, which is painful, unworthy, and unprofitable. Avoiding these extremes, the Tathagata, the perfect one, or the Buddha, has realized the middle path. It gives vision, gives knowledge, and leads to calm, to insight, to enlightenment, and to nirvana. And what is that middle path realized by the Tathagata? It is the noble eightfold path and nothing else, namely, right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So the Eightfold Path is the way of the Buddha's, the way we walk to follow the Buddha's way. It's the middle way. It's not an extremely austere practice, nor is it a super indulgent practice. It's a middle way, and that's the way that takes us to the more harmonious life that we're hoping to find ourselves living. Okay, so I'm going to finish there for tonight. There will be time for questions, which you can put in the chat. But I'm going to set you some more homework, and this is again a pretty straightforward exercise for you to do. I just want you to sit in a chair for 15 minutes every day. Just sit. Now, this is not a meditation exercise, and I know some of you are probably very experienced meditators and some of you have never meditated at all. So it's perhaps a little bit more for those who are not experienced in meditation. I don't want you to meditate. I want you to just sit. I don't want you to be reading a book or listening to music or anything. I just want you to sit for 15 minutes and just observe what comes up, observe what happens. Okay, I'm finishing there for tonight, so I will invite questions. It's probably helpful if you put your questions in the chat because I can see them and answer them from there. So I have a question about meditation. Do you have any suggestions where to start with guided meditations? So many. Well, the first thing I would have to say is you really should join some of the meditation classes that the Buddhist Society offers. There are meditation classes running throughout the week. They have lunchtime classes on a Monday and a Friday. There are evening classes as well, and you can learn basic meditation techniques from any of those. There are so many meditation apps out there, as I'm sure you know, because you've said you've been overwhelmed with the choice. I've probably tried many of them, or possibly all of them. And I suppose what I've come back to over the years now is simply a timer. So simply a timer. And there are various types of meditation. We're going to cover this in the last lecture of the course, the different forms of meditation. But I simply do probably a Vipassana type meditation to a timer. But if you want to have a guided meditation, there are many apps out there. Some of them are subscription, some of them are free. But I would suggest to begin with, if you've never meditated before, that you might start by joining one of the Buddhist Society courses and start there. If there is no I, who is it that suffers because of attachment? That's a very good question, isn't it? If there's no I, who or what is it that's suffering? Well, the thing that we are, the five aggregates, there are elements in that, aren't there? There is the sensations, the pleasant, unpleasant, the indifferent. There is the mental formulations, that mind flowing forward, the worries and thoughts and things. The entire structure is unsatisfactory and uncomfortable if those thoughts that have arisen from your wanting, your desire, your aversion, if the thoughts are unpleasant thoughts, then there will be suffering and unpleasantness. But there is no I who's thinking those thoughts and no I that's suffering. It's simply the situation we find ourselves in is an unsatisfactory, suffering situation. But the delusion that we have is that I have been thinking these thoughts, or I have been wanting this thing, and therefore I am suffering. The Buddha didn't say I suffer. The Buddha just said there is suffering. He didn't attach it to anything or anybody. He just said there is suffering, and indeed there is suffering. But it is not I who suffers, because there is no I, but the whole constellation of what constitutes what I recognize as myself, those aggregates, these are all causing a suffering situation to arise. But if you go look around in the world, I mean, there is suffering. You might say the whole of society is suffering. It's not necessarily I. Long question here. I am the architect of my own suffering. Yeah. That's a long chat. One thing I would say in response to that comment is that when I first came into a Buddhist practice myself, which was probably 30 years ago now, I was in a place of really genuine suffering, as indeed I'm sure many of you have been in yourself over the years. And I decided it was time to take Buddhism seriously, having been tinkering with it for a few years, and actually do a little bit of reading, a little bit of practice. And when I read the Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths, do you know, it was like a light bulb went on, that moment of realization that I was actually the architect of my own misery through my own misguided wanting and wishing things were other and different. It was just literally, I remember the moment of thinking, my goodness, this is the thing that I have never understood all of these years, is that if I didn't have this response to the situation I find myself in, it wouldn't be so difficult. It wouldn't be so unpleasant. And as I say, that was a light bulb moment for me, was when I finally looked at and understood the Four Noble Truths. I suddenly thought, wow, that's actually real and profound. And it was then that I realized that Buddhism, was something I needed to study. Towards the end of this evening talk, you said nirvana is a state of mind, not a place. Would you say the Pure Land is a state of mind, not a place? I'm not a Pure Land Buddhist, so I would find that very difficult. Joe, I know you are a Pure Land Buddhist, so do you want to unmute and say if you have a specific view on that?
I have some thoughts on it, but my thinking is evolving on that topic. To a great extent, I would agree that nirvana is a place between my ears. It is in my, setting aside no self for a moment, it's something that I have as a concept. And perhaps the Pure Land is as well. Perhaps I'm living in the Pure Land here and now.
I would hope so, because that, I think, is what we're all trying to realize, is that we are where we want to be. We are where we want to be, but we don't know it. That's really quite important take-home message from this whole course, is you actually are already where you want to be. Now, I just need to canter on through some of these questions. How can one live without being attached to things needed for basic living? Well, of course, you have to have food and water and shelter and warmth and relationships, but you don't have to be attached to them. There's a difference between living in a world where we eat, we drink, etc., and being strongly attached to my likes and dislikes about those things. So clearly in the morning, if someone says, would you like tea or would you like coffee? I have a preference. I might say, yes, I would like a cup of coffee. I would like a black coffee with no milk. But I don't have such a strong attachment to my need for the black coffee with no milk that if you brought me a cup of tea with milk in it, I would immediately start to simmer and boil with rage. That's the difference between a simple preference and an attachment. So I was out last week with some friends, and it's a bit naughty really, but one of my friends has a gluten intolerance. And she was telling me a long story about how she'd been to a wedding and she said, oh, I can't eat gluten. And she'd had to eat just terrible food at the wedding. And she was really annoyed that they hadn't provided a gluten-free option for her. And all the time she's talking to her, I'm thinking, you don't have celiac disease. This is just a minor preference, a minor dietary preference. And because you expressed your dietary preference and made it a big deal, you couldn't have the pasta and the bread and all those things. You had to basically have a plate of beetroot with some spinach. That was your choice, because you could have just eaten what was provided, but she couldn't because she's so attached to the idea that she has gluten intolerance. And as she was talking to me, I was thinking, you put yourself into that suffering situation by your own choice, and now you're moaning to me about it. Was the gracious thing would be to say, I'm at the wedding, I'll just eat what's prepared. Anyway, moving on. How does one move forwards and stay on track in achieving goals without wanting for them or clinging to ideas? Well, you have to, let me give you a Zen story. So there's a Zen master and his student. Let me see if I can get the story correct. They're traveling along and someone tries to take something from them, tries to steal something from them. And the student says to the master, what do you do if someone tries to steal something from you? What would you do? And the master said, well, I would whack him over the head with my umbrella, but I would do it with loving kindness. So the point is, just because we're Buddhists doesn't mean we're complete doormats sitting around waiting for everything to happen as it will happen. You are allowed to set goals, you're allowed to ask for things, you're allowed to move towards the things that you want. The point is that if you don't achieve the goal or the thing that you want, you don't want to get into a great to-do about it. But there is no reason why you can't just move things along towards your aspiration, your goal, what it wants to be. But what you can't do is drive it forward with such ferocity and single-mindedness. And when you don't achieve it, get really angry and upset about it, because then you've just caused more suffering. I don't need to draw your attention to what's happening in the world of politics in the UK at the moment, but you can see what happens when people are so single-minded about what they want that they can't see any other way. That's how we get trapped into suffering through this. But it's perfectly okay to prefer tea to coffee. It's perfectly okay to say, I would like to apply for a promotion. It's perfectly okay to, to say, I hope the weather's nice tomorrow because I'm planning a picnic. Where it goes wrong is when we get so fixated that this must happen, or my world will be ruined. My day will be ruined if the weather, if it rains and I can't have the picnic, or if I don't get that job, I'm going to fall into despair. So it's getting the middle way. It's between doing nothing and just sitting around passively like a big amoeba waiting for life to happen to us, or saying, no, I can move things along, but I don't want to get so passionately attached to the goal in mind. You have to accept that when things don't happen the way you want them, you just have to accept that that is how it is and not get attached to it. Because a lot of what makes us unhappy in life is that the thing that we had set our hearts on, we don't achieve. The situation that we had dreamed of doesn't come around, and then we suffer. If we can just step back from that and say, I would like that, but if I don't get it, that's also fine, then we don't have to suffer. Right, we've reached the end of tonight, and I'm going to call the meeting to a close. So next week, we're going to talk about the Noble Eightfold Path. So we're going to go into each of those elements in detail. And I shall, hopefully, some of you will have time to sit in a chair for 15 minutes. Otherwise, I wish you all a pleasant evening.